So if it's okay, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Manvi Tiwari of the Global Mental Health Peer Network. And Manvi, I'm sorry that you're speaking slightly sooner than we had anticipated, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about lived experience, activism and expertise, difference, object and ground zero. Manvi.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Manvi Tiwari. I am the Country Executive of India at the Global Mental Health Peer Network. I am a person with lived experience of obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety. My lived experience dates back to when my mother was diagnosed with depression and obsessive compulsive disorder when I was 12 years old. So I also have lived experience as a carer. Can we move to the next slide, please? Today, the career that I'll be talking about is one that you're unlikely to hear about in a setting like this, and that is that of a lived experience expert or an activist. To begin with, let's start by clearing out some very common misconceptions or preconceived biases about the term itself, lived experience expert and activist. We often use these terms interchangeably, and I don't blame it because they're also implemented interchangeably in the present day scenario. So a lived experience expert is basically somebody who, I'll actually start with a lived experience activist, that's easier to explain. A lived experience activist is somebody who fights for a place at the decision-making table for people who live or have lived with anxiety or other mental health conditions or mental distress. While a lived experience expert is somebody, when there is already a place at the decision-making table, they are the people who give their inputs and help design programs, policies, and so on. That's the basic difference between a lived experience expert and an activist. However, present day scenario, as I said, they are termed and they are used and implemented interchangeably. However, the goal is to get to a time when even those without lived experience will fight for a place at the decision-making table for those with lived experience. Move to the next slide, please. When we speak about a career, I think a big part of that is knowing what you're expected to do and where you're headed as part of a professional in that career field. So some of the things that one as a lived experience activist or an expert is expected to do is raise the profile of mental health. And this is also one of the most widely recognized use of lived experience. The second one would be provide qualitative information. So as a lived experience expert, it's important that you lend your lived experience to those in academia or to researchers in order for them to yield more accurate evidence and more quality information, which can then be translated into change, again, by those in lived experience. I will talk more about this in my slides further. The third one and the fourth one are quite intertangled, and they are strengthening the stakeholder engagement mechanism and developing a stakeholder leadership mechanism. We have quite a stakeholder engagement mechanism, but what we do not have is a stakeholder leadership mechanism, and we're actively working towards that. So I think one of the important parts of being a lived experience activist or expert is also that you're supposed to strengthen the lived experience mechanism and how people with lived experience are involved in decision making, and how they're not just involved or engaged, but are given are in positions of power. The last one, but it's actually not the last. The list is very long. This is these are some of the few that I shortlisted. The last one here is questioning policies and frameworks. I think a big part of being an activist, not just a lived experience activist or expert, is that you need to question policies, frameworks, or even statements that are put out by anybody who's in power position or anybody around you in your daily life. I think those are some of the objects of being a lived experience activist or an expert. Can we move to the next slide, please? The next two slides basically are just for you to have an understanding of what my analogy on mental health and its development is, and where I place lived experience activism and expertise at. I think mental health development basically has two pillars, one of them being academia, which is researchers and a lot of other academics, while the other one is lived experience. There's also an external pillar that we have, which is policymakers, and I'll elaborate in my next slide more about how lived experience plays the role of a translator between academia and policymakers. Next slide, please. I think it all starts with lived experience. It is lived experience that is taken by the academia and is used to yield accurate evidence, information, and reports, which are then again by lived experience acting as a translator, are being taken to policymakers by experts and activists, and policymakers translate that exact evidence, reports, and information into change, taking that as the base. So I think I've always said this before, and I'll say this once again, lived experience acts as a translator, and the entire process of mental health development starts and ends with lived experience, because it is lived experience that the academia analyzes and yields out information and statistics on, and it is also lived experience which will at the end be affected by policies and laws and strategies and programs that are put out by policymakers or those in power positions. Next slide, please. The last slide talks about...
So I was just going to say you have about 30 seconds left, but you're on the last slide, so I will step back out and allow you to finish.
Thank you. The last slide talks about ground zero, which is basically where to start from as a lived experience activist or a lived experience expert. I think a very integral part of that is stories, because out of all the people that have all the doctorates, double digits in doctorates, in fact, and accreditations, why should somebody listen to you? And that is the answer to that is your lived experience, that I have this lived experience and I have this story, and this is all that I've been through and done. And that is why I am the right person that people should hear here. The next one is networks. I think networks such as my own, the one that I belong to, the Global Mental Health Peer Network, it's very important to be parts of such networks, because at the end, I think these networks somehow act as focal points for opportunities, for innovations, and for a lot of other things that ultimately will help you grow in your journey as a lived experience activist or an expert. Harnessing the power of digital, this one needs no introduction. Digital has grown and is bound to grow even more, especially in LMIC, especially in countries like India, where from the youngest to the oldest, everybody has a phone in their hand, everybody is very prone to the internet. So I think it's very important to somehow take your activism, your expertise, and your advocacy online. The last one is something how I started my advocacy and expertise journey with, and that was I took part in consultations, in participations, and studies, and that was how I stepped into the world of mental health, and I started my journey as a lived experience activist and an expert, and that's how I think is a good way to step into the journey of an activist or an expert. The last thing that I want to end by saying is that as a lived experience expert or an activist, it's inevitable, in fact, to feel this way, that you're at times going to be on tables where you're surrounded with people who have decades of experience and double digits in accreditations. And at that point, it's inevitable to question yourself and say that, why am I supposed to be here? And what have I done to be at this table? But then your lived experience is the answer to that. I think you speak your truth. And as I said, it starts and ends with lived experience. It is all about you. We can move to the next slide, and that would pretty much be the end of my presentation. I hope you take away something useful from here, and I hope I inspire somebody at least to become a lived experience expert and activist. Thank you.